natural method, and I thought, well, this could in some way be connected to PBL, but then where do I stop? This could go on forever, so I decided not to do that. Instead, I decided to start by identifying what were the first PBL programs. Now, there's a lot of proto-PBL programs, things that could have been, things that could have inspired, but that I didn't feel qualified for the purposes of this research. So what did I look for? I looked for a higher education institution because, well, there were a lot of things happening in K-12, but that's not what I was wanting to research at that point. I was more interested in young adults. Then the education had to be centered around problems, emphasis on centered. Yes, there were some places that used problems, sometimes by chance. Yes, there were some places that included problems later, but really these had to be programs where the learning starts with a problem. And a problem, not a project, a problem. And then these institutions had to have a vision on education. So yes, there were a lot of agricultural colleges, or engineering colleges even in the 1870s who used projects. But they didn't have a clear vision on education, they were just doing it because they might as well. And then these schools had to have invented or significantly changed a way of learning. Why? Well, because there were some people who tried out a few things and then stopped. Like Bremen University, for instance, in Germany, who experimented with projects, but they had to stop within a few years. And this ties into my last point. They had to have had the time for reflection on what they were doing. And for instance, some people talk about a university in Brazil that already experimented with revolutionary ways of doing education, but they were shut down after 2 years, so they couldn't reflect on it. So what did I do? Looking at all these criteria, I found 4 universities that I would consider the pioneers of the PBL method around the world. And those were McMaster University, who opened in 1979 in medicine, and they called it problem-based learning. There was Roskilde University, the older sister of Aalborg, as it were, which opened near Copenhagen in 1972, and they called it problem-oriented, participant-directed education. That was the title given by their chief researcher, Knut Illeris. Maastricht University started with problem-steered education, or PGO in Dutch, in 1974. Some people say 76, but actually the program started in 74. They just were a bit late on getting the official approval of the government. Aalborg University started the same year as Maastricht, and they started with problem-oriented, project-based education, which in the 90s was shortened to problem-based learning. Okay, so this is my starting point, just so you understand where we're going with this talk, and why I'm not going to talk about all and every type of philosophical debate that there can be. But even then, I had to be methodological about this. How do we do that? Well, almost nothing has been written about the history of PBL, so you have to start with the sources. And that means spending weeks on end in archives and all these places. And going back to the sources, you have to find the people and ask them. And that's tricky because memory can fool people, and this was almost 50 years ago. And also, I had to dig out publications that you would not believe exist, like replicas of books from the 1850s. The internet is a very useful tool. I don't know how people did research before the internet. And then, I ended up with this. And that makes no sense whatsoever. I had names being thrown around by people. Somebody would mention Grundtvig, and somebody else would say, no, this was most definitely Dewey. And somebody else would say, oh, yes, no, Flexner was the one who inspired it, and I still had no idea what I was doing. So, how do we move on from there to make sense of what the origins of PBL are? We make historical trees. See, and this is important to understand in terms of the dogma that comes sometimes today with education methods. The history of an education method is a puzzle. We need to piece it together. It's the product of a long evolution. And to get a revolution, you need things that come before. So you need to make sense of what has influenced what. And it's a little bit of an inductive puzzle. And it's quite possible, in fact, I'm quite hoping that in 10 years some historians tell me that it was completely wrong and John Dewey had nothing to do with Harvard Business School. Okay, so now I've set the scene. Now I've shown you what I've done and how I've worked. Let's go to the interesting point of this topic. The three great intellectual battles. Is this the right PowerPoint? Is this the second PowerPoint? No, it's not. This is the first PowerPoint I sent you. Apologies. This is the old PowerPoint. This. I'll tell you the story without the slides. I just had a couple of slides on the background stories of these two chaps and of the chaps that follow, but these are like my friends now. I've worked with them so long, I kind of know them by heart, so I'll talk to you from memory. Okay, so back to the starting point. So, 3 battles. Why 3 battles? Because after 4 years of research, well, I realized that there were some pivotal key points where some decisions were made that changed the face of PBL, but most of you don't know that these happen. How many of you know John Dewey? How many of you know Kilpatrick? Ooh, a lot less people there. How many of you knew that the two had an argument? Nestor. How many of you know Carl Rogers? Oh, not that many. Robert Major? 2 people. Wow. How many of you know Howard Barrows? I'm impressed. And Hank Schmidt? Okay, so I'm going to give you a bit of background on the authors out of my head. It's the beautiful thing about being a historian, you feel like you're kind of talking to ghosts while you're doing your research. No, we're not crazy, it's just, it comes with a profession. So this chap here is John Dewey, for those that recognize him, and he's clearly the one that you've heard of the most. See, John Dewey was a bit of a phenomenon in his time. John Dewey was born in the mid-19th century, and by the time he was 15, he was already at university. And by the time he was 25, he already had his PhD. And then John Dewey became a teacher at Columbia University in America, where he studied education philosophy. But not just that, it would be really restrictive to call John Dewey simply an education philosopher. John Dewey studied the philosophy of society. He was concerned with broader questions. Back then, people didn't really have disciplines. They concerned themselves with the broader questions of society. And John Dewey wrote a number of publications. Now, when I say a number, he wrote over 1,000 pieces in his lifetime. The most important, I don't know if you've heard of these, Democracy in Education, does that ring a bell? Experience in Education. But the most important, and the one which crystallized what was known as the problem method, was How We Think in 1910. The problem method wasn't invented by Dewey, because he had a group of friends around him at Columbia University, such as McCurry. And together, they came up with this idea of the problem method. What was the problem method? John Dewey describes it beautifully in How We Think. He says, imagine you're washing the dishes. Simple, right? And then you put a glass upside down, and there are soap bubbles around it. And suddenly, the soap bubbles are absorbed and go to the inside of the glass. Why does this happen? And that was the start. This was a problem for John Dewey. Why is this? How does this happen? Does this ring a bell to the PBL practitioners among here? John Dewey didn't call it PBL, but essentially he foresaw a lot of the things that we now do in PBL. And you probably know that his biggest credo was learning by doing, learning through learner experience. Okay, so where does Kilpatrick come in? William Herd Kilpatrick was born 20 years after Dewey, and he was a bit of a prodigy child as well. He got his PhD in 1915, and 3 years later, he was already a full professor of philosophy. So, I wish, but things don't happen quite like that anymore. Now, Kilpatrick just so happened to study at Columbia University. Guess who his teacher was? John Dewey. Now, Some historians have said that Kilpatrick was a bit fame-hungry, and he longed for the fame that his teacher, John Dewey, had. Now, we know this because Kilpatrick was an avid diary writer, and he left his diaries to the archives for us to look at. And Kilpatrick said, I really admire Dewey, but I've got to do better. Try beating 1,000 publications. So he thought, I need to do something radical. So picture the scene. This is, the World War I is still raging, and John Dewey writes in his kind of masterpiece, his magnum opus, Democracy in Education, that an individual who has a question, which being really a question to him instigates his curiosity, which feeds his eagerness for information that will help him cope with it, and who has at command an equipment which will permit these interests to take effect, is intellectually free. Do you recognize some of the words of PBL here? Interest, curiosity, question. And for him, this was the key to freedom. But when Kilpatrick read this is what he understood. That the teacher's success, if we believe in democracy, will consist in gradually eliminating himself or herself from the success of the procedure. Kilpatrick thought, we don't need teachers anymore. That must be what Dewey meant. And Kilpatrick wrote in 1918, so 2 years after Democracy in Education, he wrote The Project Method, which you can see in the back. And his name has forever since been associated with the Project Method. But what was this project method? Because he didn't invent the idea of projects, they'd been around since the 1870s. It was the use of a purposeful act. What's that? Anything that has meaning to you, really. So, in essence, well, if you're studying Das Kapital with intent, that's a project. Anything and everything could be a project. And then his critics slammed down on him and said, that's not a method, that's an intention, that's an ideal. How can you call yourself the equal or the disciple of Dewey? And Dewey, upon reading this, was furious. And you remember I said in 1910 he wrote How We Think? Well, he rewrote it in 1933. And he included a most vicious criticism of his former student Kilpatrick in this re-edition. And he previously had criticized the authoritarian types of old education, but now he also slammed down on what he called the free education, which he said went too far. And so he said that the older types of instructions would tend to treat the teacher as a dictator, and that's what he had already said in his previous edition. But now he said there is a new type of evil lurking, and that is trying to treat the teacher as a negligible factor, almost an evil. And Dewey's idea was, the teacher is important. He's the intellectual leader of a group. And not because he has some kind of official authority, but because he has deeper knowledge and matured experience. And this is pervasive throughout Dewey's work after this, that you cannot do these types of education, these problem methods, and later on PBL, without a teacher who can be a guide. And why is this battle important for PBL? Because those who read the literature on PBL, I'm sure, have seen that there are calls to get rid of tutors or supervisors entirely, and debates about whether anybody can be a tutor. Sure, we can put a secretary in the group as a tutor. That was the legend that was going around Maastricht University in the early 70s. Should a project supervisor know anything about the topic? Well, Dewey would say yes. And although for many years it seems the balance was in favor of Kilpatrick, studies done in the 80s and 90s and 2000s have shown that, in fact, content knowledge is necessary for you to be able to guide properly. How would you know which questions to ask unless you knew about the topic? And so Dewey, with no knowledge whatsoever of cognitive psychology, with no help from empirical data, had already foreseen what the empirical studies showed, well, almost 60 years later. So I clearly award that victory to Dewey. All right, the second round. Then here we take you to the 1950s and 60s. Rogers versus Major. So, who was Carl Rogers? Carl Rogers was quite an extraordinary man. He was an American psychologist. But you see, he was a bit of a strange psychologist because he didn't believe what the psychology books told him at the time. Psychology at the time was very much geared towards what we will see after, which is behaviorism, the idea that you can condition people, which had been around since Pavlov's time. No, Rogers was a colleague of Maslow. I'm sure you've heard of Maslow and the human needs pyramid. Well, Rogers was the founder of a movement called humanist psychology. And Rogers believed in something called self-directed learning. He was the one who coined the term self-directed learning. And he believed that basically learning had to be an act of meaning for the student. He had a hard time with this. People were not prepared to accept these ideas, except possibly in a little medical school in northern Canada, where I have found traces not only of the use of the word self-directed learning as early as the mid-1960s, but also bits and pieces of Carl Rogers' writing inserted in the minutes of the Education Committee of McMaster. Opposed to Rogers, there was the behaviorist movement. Now, what is behaviorism? Do you know what behaviorism is? Okay, so behaviorism, you've heard perhaps of Brutus Skinner, who did experiments with rats and pigeons, where they would have to press a pedal and then get rewarded or punished for what they did. And the belief, and this was called operant conditioning, was that if you did that, you could train an animal to do almost anything, provided you kept reinforcing the right kind of behavior, or the terminal behavior, as it was called by the psychologists. Now, Major, following on from the work on Skinner on the teaching machine, which was a kind of imagined machine that could treat students like the pigeons, thought, hang on, I'm going to write a book using Skinner's theories for education. And Skinner became hugely popular. Hugely, hugely popular. There was a belief that this was the be-all and end-all of psychology, so much so that in 1972, California passed a law whereby these behaviorist objectives for education were mandatory. So you can kind of see where this dispute is going. Well, Major proposed that the point of education is that you were interested in communicating skills and knowledge to your student. You take the knowledge, you give it to the student. And you communicate it in a way that the student can demonstrate that they have learned. Like the pigeon pressing, okay, has the pigeon pressed the correct lever. And so the student must demonstrate their achievement of your instructional objectives. Needless to say, Rogers was not overly fond of this theory. And he said, you know what, I feel that education should be free of judgment and evaluation. Basically, his idea was that the responsibility for learning, the responsibility for knowing that you've learned, came from within the student himself. And for this to come forth, it was not possible to evaluate him. And Rogers said, I have to be in a relationship with my student where not even from within myself, from within my feelings, I'm evaluating him. This will set him free to be a self-responsible person. Notice the contrast. I'll just make it a bit clearer for you. This is the contrast. What is the purpose of education according to the behaviorists? Learners have to demonstrate that they can perform in a certain way. And for Rogers, it has to be significant and congruent with people's experience. Who determines what should be learned? For the behaviorist, it's the teacher. For Rogers, it's the learner, with guidance. How should we assess or evaluate learning? Well, obviously through a test with questions for behaviorists, where there are very simple and very clear answers. And for Rogers, it was a sort of contract, where the student would set a plan with criteria that he had himself chosen, and then go through it with the guidance of his instructor. How would you know that you had achieved something? For the behaviorists, well, clearly you had to see whether they'd achieved the terminal behavior. Did the student press the right lever? And for Rogers, it was a success if the student felt that he had learned something for his own purpose. Okay, so I've put victory Rogers, but this is a qualified victory. This is what happened. At McMaster, they used both. How's that possible? And some kind of historical schizophrenia going on here. So, in the early days of McMaster, although they were committed to self-directed learning, although they were committed to the humanist approach, They still try to fit in the Magerian learning objectives. Why? This doesn't make any sense. And I thought about this question for a while. How is it possible that such a humanist PBL school is trying to fit in behaviorist objectives? This is the only rational answer I could come up with. Behaviorism was so prominent, so important in the education thinking of the 1960s and early 70s that it just seemed like you had to include it. And so you had this very strange thing of the founders of PBL struggling with how they were going to fit meaning into a terminal behavior type objective. And this went on for about 5 years, after which they finally realized the error of their ways and said, oh, we give up on the Magerian learning objectives. And they decided to do away with assessment altogether. There were no exams in the original PBL program, only the final license for medicine at the end. Now, I put victory for Rogers, but for how long? You see, with the return of the 1980s and the 90s and the 2000s, more and more the pressure is on for measurable learning objectives. You just need to look at Denmark and what's happened with the governments in the 2000s that tried to force people into doing only individual exams, because you can't really quantify group exams like you can quantify individual exams. So, you know, I'm a bit pessimistic about the victory of humanist psychology. I think we need to bear that in mind when we move forward and try to change PBL. This, for me, is a really important battle, and we can't take this victory for granted. Okay, so let me move on now to the 1980s and 90s. Howard Barrows versus Hank Schmidt. Well, Howard Barrows was a medical doctor from California. Well, some people say he invented problem-based learning, and that is absolutely not true, because by the time he joined McMaster as a full member of staff, that was 1971. The PBL program had already been started for 2 years at that point. So I think it's a little bit of a stretch to say that he invented problem-based learning. Now, Howard Barrows was most famous for working with simulated patients. So his idea of problems was that you would have a person who's acting, pretending to be sick, and you'd put students there, and that would be their problem. And they'd have to work around that. Okay, so the issue with that, though, is that Howard Barrows wasn't so much concerned with the content of medicine. He thought there must be some kind of an algorithm, a kind of way by which you can solve any medical problem if you have the required clinical reasoning skills, problem-solving skills. That's all you need. Then you can just apply that like a computer to anything, any problem that you want. And this was quite popular, actually, in the 1970s. There were books written called Human Problem Solving that were based on computers. And Barrows left McMaster somewhere in the late 1970s and went to Southern Illinois. This is quite important because you've probably heard of the book Problem-Based Learning by Howard Barrows. So when Howard Barrows wrote that, actually, what he was describing was his ideal PBL. It had nothing to do with what was going on at McMaster, as I found out by comparing the book with the archives. This is quite important for what happens next. Okay, so who is Hank Schmidt? Hank Schmidt is Dutch and joined Maastricht University. If you remember, that was the third university that started PBL. They copied it from McMaster and then changed it in their own way, but that was 1974, and Hank Schmidt joined in 1974. What he did was he was among the first to do systematic research on PBL. His first research was in 1977, published his first book in 1980, and to this date has published 56 papers on PBL and a few books here and there. And Hank Schmidt was particularly interested in this idea that problem-based learning was not really something about problem solving. Okay, so where does this take us? This is the famous book from 1980. And Howard Barrows said in it that he really was concerned with the student's acquisition of clinical problem-solving skills. Yes, he said, yeah, you can acquire foundations of medicine, but they have to be applicable straight away to the problems of a doctor. And this could be translated, of course, to engineering. Yeah, sure, you can learn the content of engineering, but only if you can apply it straight away. You don't need to know the theory, you just need to know how to solve problems, and then you can solve any engineering problem. So that was the basis on which Howard Barrows worked. And the thing is, he didn't apply this at McMaster because he wasn't in charge of setting the program, but he did try to apply to Southern Illinois University. Guess what? It didn't work too well. Okay, why? Well, I found, bizarrely enough, a letter exchange between Hank Schmidt and Howard Barrows from 1983. And they discussed this idea that somehow, on the one hand, you had the problem-solving skills, and on the other hand, you had the acquisition of knowledge. And I asked Hank Schmidt, so when did you first realize that there was a difference in opinion between you and Howard Barrows? And he said, I'd always thought, because I'd read Karl Popper, that problems were actually just a means of activating what you know, your knowledge, and that you had to start with knowledge in order to be able to solve anything. So this is the radical opposite of this computer algorithm model of the human cognitive architecture. And so they exchanged this letter in which they recognized that they had different approaches. But what does this mean for PBL today? Well, Hank Schmidt carried on the empirical research, and the thing about Howard Barrows is he was not too good at empirical studies. He didn't do much in the way of that, so most of the things that he wrote were based on his ideas rather than on data. But Hank Schmidt researched the question, and finally in 1993 he wrote a paper in which he tried to reconcile what PBL does with what we knew at the time, given cognitive psychology, about the human cognitive architecture. How do people learn? And he found 5 things. The 5 things that make problem-based learning work as a learning tool are that they activate your prior knowledge. By allowing you to elaborate on that knowledge, it anchors better into your long-term memory. You restructure that knowledge by elaborating on it, by confronting yourself with a question that you cannot answer. The problem provides a context which activates the relevant, what called in psychological jargon, schemas, which allow you to remember this longer. And finally, it's motivation and interest. Now notice the word interest. That's what Dewey said, although he didn't know, cognitive psychology wasn't even invented at the time. So, these were the 5 things that determined that PBL was successful. Do we see problem-solving skills in there? No, because the theory is problem-solving skills are merely a wider range of things that you know and that you can draw from when a problem comes to you. It's merely a greater base of knowledge that you can borrow from to solve a problem. There is no algorithm, magic solution for this. Okay, so of those 3 battles, what has come to us today in the 2010s is a sort of PBL dogma almost in a lot of places. I'm talking mainly about the medical world, but I've seen it in other disciplines as well. I've heard talk of a pure PBL, that somehow we have to go back to the pure PBL, and there is only one way of doing PBL, and that is this method or this method, and then we'll invent 100 other acronyms for other things because they're not quite the pure PBL. This doesn't make sense to me. How can we change PBL, make it better, make it a more relevant education method for our learners if we're talking as if it was some kind of religion? So the reason that I showed you these disputes and how they were resolved is to show you that, well, facts, and in this case the PBL method, is constructed. History is written by historians not based on facts, but based on their interpretation. We have to remember that all the things that come to us were built, were invented, were fought for, were disputed, were stopped, were started again. And that as historians we can only catch glimpses of what has happened. If we're really serious about changing PBL, about making it more relevant, we need to go back and we need to have a 4th big intellectual dispute about PBL. We need to start talking again in the way that Dewey and Kilpatrick were talking. We need to start arguing like Rogers and Major. And of course, I'm heavily biased in favor of the humanist approach. But if it hadn't been for the behaviorists, would we have been able to make sense of how important the humanist approach was for PBL? Probably not. We need disputes. We don't need agreement on everything all the time. And so that is why it is so important for engineers and doctors alike and philosophers and historians to get together and really open these debates and be open to discussion and open to change. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you for this inspiring talk and for your enthusiasm and for remembering all those dates and names and everything. Well, I'm impressed. So now we go on to the questions and comments, and so I welcome you to, we have a bit more time since we started a bit earlier. So, yes, we have a question here.
I have a big voice, but I'm happy to take that as well.
Okay, I think we have a microphone.
Thank you very much. I think it's really interesting that you see there are some schools, some universities.
Could you please introduce yourself?
I'm sorry.
And institution?
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Michael Christie. I'm a professor at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia. People think it's a joke. But it is its name, and the sunshine does shine most of the year. Paradise. Okay, so I was a professor of higher education at Stockholm University. And I think it's very interesting that you have a few PBL universities that have actually changed their architecture to create a PBL environment. So my question to you is, but first of all, thank you very much. It's a wonderful talk. My question really is, when you have most universities who fundamentally give qualifications to people on the basis of written examinations, can you see perhaps that MA may have won the day in that sense, and how big a struggle it will be to convince people of what you believe and what I believe as well, maybe what a lot of people believe.
Thank you very much for your question. Indeed, you've pointed out, you've hit the nail on the head. For me, the most important of the three battles was the one between Rogers and Major. And I said Carl Rogers won, but for how long? Because indeed, we have a whole systemic global problem. It's affecting higher education, but it's affecting everything else. And that is, well, the victory of the neoliberal model of education management. The idea that you have to have output that's measurable, quantifiable, standardized, that everybody has to take the same exams and come out with a grade that can then be shared around the entire globe and mean the same thing. And this not only doesn't make sense in terms of the way people learn, but it doesn't make sense anyway, because how can you compare two people as if they were two lab rats? What can we do about this? Now that's the interesting question. Is there a way out for us? Well, honestly, I'm going to sound a bit radical here, but I'm allowed, I'm a philosopher. We need a complete overhaul of the way we think about education, but the way we manage education. We need education ministers who are not thinking just about their QS Times ranking, who are not just thinking about how much money they will make off the graduates that come out of their degree programs, but who are genuinely concerned with education and what that means for people. How that will happen, well, I can only venture a guess. Well, I think we need to rethink fundamentally who we choose as our education leaders and how we choose them. And it's going to take a lot of courage for us to break out of this. But do we have a choice? Because honestly, education is the foundation of the next generation of people who will take out of the mess we've put ourselves in. With regards to the environment, sustainability, which is one of Annette's key points of research. These things, how can we do them unless we manage to fix our education system? So it's urgent. And we don't have a choice, it has to happen.
More questions? Yes.
Hello, Michal Flaherty from Dublin Institute of Technology. I was really gripped by that Rogers versus Major debate there. And you awarded it to Rogers in the area of PBL. In the area of general education, I'd probably award it possibly to majors, in particular in the area of special needs education, where methods like say applied behavior analysis would be very much based on desired behaviors and reward and that for achieving certain behaviors, particularly in the area of autism. And so when you're looking through the options there, the winning factor for something for a particular education is outcomes, results. So there is, say for applied behaviour analysis, there is actual scientific data, there's tests, there's clinical trials that will support that. Whereas for other ones that don't have those metrics, you know, if you're just choosing, say for your child, you're a particular type of education, there's no metrics, you can't measure. You can't say to someone, well, this is the best one because. Or if I put a question to you, you know, if you were having surgery in the morning, would you want to have surgery from a doctor who felt he'd learned something from his education, or somebody, or a doctor who proved that he can do this procedure under laboratory conditions, or someone who felt he'd learned something of meaning at medical school?
Thanks, that's a very good question, and I've heard the same about the airline pilot. Would you rather fly with somebody who felt he had learned something or somebody who'd gone through the manual? And it's almost a rhetorical question, right? But then, how did McMaster manage it? The first year of McMaster, all 19 of the students who came in passed the the medical license of Canada. So I guess that the assessment in McMaster for the PBL wasn't in the PBL itself, in the program, but just that threshold before the profession. So it was run at the profession level rather than at the education level, if that makes sense. I mean, that is one way to consider it. Maastricht had an alternative solution. They decided that rather than having exams which could be studied for, which would induce this kind of terminal outcome behavior, they would have what was called a progress test, which was a bank of questions that covered the entire program of the 6 years, and students would take it 4 times a year, and then they couldn't study for it because it could be on anything for the entire program of the 6 years. But that did give them the freedom to learn at the pace they wanted and at the time they wanted, and then just measure themselves against the final things that are expected of a doctor. So some solutions have been thought to that problem, but it's always balancing your personal education wishes with society's needs, right? And that's a question we need to address seriously rather than imposing the society needs to everybody without taking into account people's personal learning growth.
I think it's me, sorry. You can get my microphone afterwards. Sorry. I'm Bettina Dahl Søndergaard. I'm from Aalborg University. I'm sitting. Thank you. And it was a very interesting talk, and I'm looking very much forward to reading your PhD. Also, I was thinking about these debates, and actually, the person just before me almost asked my question, but not completely maybe, because I was also thinking mostly about this budget versus major debate, because I think does it have to be either or? I think it's like going from one ditch to the other, and because I mean I agree with you that when you have some criticism of outcome-based education, that that's how I hear it, that it can be too narrow, that as long as you can perform a certain way, you pass, and then there's no thinking. But I think it's just a matter of how you formulate those learning outcomes. They can be quite open. And so I think, because I really think you need exams. Because people, I mean, also, you can look at students, whenever if it's just a pass-fail exam, they don't work as hard as if it's with grades. And I think it's, I mean, maybe because I'm not a humanist, I don't know, but I really think you need exams. You can't just wait until the end. I think you need, and we need to maybe some balance those two guys in a way, because you can't just be completely behaviorist, but you can't also just be completely, oh, laissez-faire, let's hope for the best, the plane doesn't crash. And so, yeah, I don't know if you have some comments.
Yeah, I think it would be erroneous to think that humanist psychology or the Rogerian method was equated with complete laissez-faire. I think the most important thing to understand that was indeed the fight between Dewey and Kilpatrick, because Kilpatrick was very much to just let them do whatever they want. We don't need teachers, we don't need exams. It's just, if it's purposeful, then it's a success. I actually consider myself very much a Deweyan, rather than Rogerian, actually. Dewey said that it was the teacher who was the person, like, without being the one who gives the knowledge, the teacher is still very much a center point of the education in Dewey's ideas, Because the teacher knows, the teacher is a content expert, the teacher has researched this, so he can guide, he can feel, he knows if the student understands or not. And I think for me, if I read Dewey, that is really a call to rehabilitate the teacher as more than just someone who has to do the steps, go through the motions. And I see this in PBL programs, especially in Holland, where we have a very much systematic approach to PBL. There are 7 steps, you do those 7 steps, and this is the outcome. We need to rehabilitate teachers and trust them that they can have a feeling for whether a student understands or not. That teaching is not something you can just invent just because you happen to know about one topic or the other. Teaching is a profession, and that should be reinstated as such, and I have great confidence in teachers in being able to ensure that people know their stuff when they leave university.
Eric?
My name is Erik Graaf. I'm presently professor at Aalborg University, but I started out in Maastricht University just a few years after Henk Schmid. So most of what you've been talking about is quite familiar to me, and I'm so grateful that you still manage to show me new angles. And the one I would like to pick up is continuing where you just were. It is the first debate between Dewey and Kilpatrick. I think, from my understanding of this debate, I had my points on Kilpatrick. There was the consequence for problem-based learning that we have a facilitator who is not acting like a teacher, who is not taking the lead and judging the students. So my real question to you is, in this debate, when you choose for Dewey, what will be the consequence of the role of the teacher when you take this to the full consequences?
Thank you for your question, and actually Dewey has answered it for me, so if anybody's interested, you can email me and I can send you a beautiful passage that Dewey wrote in 1933 in the re-edition of How We Think, called What is Then the Role of the Teachers? And in this passage he said, if you know your content, if you are a content expert, then you can ask the right questions. He said the teacher starts where the student stops. The teacher starts where the student is stuck, where the student doesn't know what to do anymore. And the teacher asks questions. This is not the Socratic method, though, although Dewey does mention it. But Socrates, all that he did was say, can you see this? Yes. Can you see that this is the consequence? Yes. Can you see that this is the outcome? Yes. Great, you've done the learning. This is not the Deweyan method. The Deweyan method is asking meaningful questions, like, okay, you said this, but what are the consequences? Think further. Okay, so where do we go from there? And the teacher knows which questions to ask because he knows the topic. And that is the major difference. The teacher is not the center. He's not giving the knowledge. He's not taking charge of the student's learning. The student is doing that. But the teacher is there as a point of confidence, where the student knows that if he goes astray, he will be shown back in a way that makes sense, so that he's not completely lost in his own learning. In a sense, Dewey foresaw the notion of scaffolding. He didn't call it that because that wasn't invented at the time, but that's what Dewey foresaw, and that is what was completely absent from Kilpatrick's writing.
Alexander Schlag, Republic Polytechnic, Singapore. I have 2 comments. Thank you very much for your explanations. The dispute might be going into a way where we take PBL, problem-based learning, and now we're discussing education. Maybe we should go and discuss PBE rather than PBL. Second comment I have, I'm a former airline captain, and the interesting part is the license testing was not taken by the educational institution, not by the school. License testing was done by a governmentally appointed examiner. So maybe we also should discuss the 2 activities of learning or education and testing and licensing as 2 separate activities, maybe taken care of by 2 separate entities.
Thank you very much. Yes, so in answer to the first, I have to say I have a profound distaste for acronyms. I'm more interested in the ideas behind them than what they're actually called, but that's just a personal quirk. So it's true that I do tend to use education and learning interchangeably, because for me, if no learning is happening, then it's not education at all. But I'm open to, the only thing I'm not open to is calling it teaching, but other than that. Regarding your second point, this is exactly the solution that had been found at McMaster. So the license was not given by the education institution, but by a professional body of medical, the Medical Licentiate of Canada in this instance. And that, in a sense, freed McMaster from having to have exams that would reflect the ideals of the medical profession. Now, Maastricht didn't have that luxury because there was no national state medical exam. So they had to come up with the alternative solutions themselves. And this is a very interesting question. If you have to vouch for the quality of your doctors yourself, or the quality of your engineers yourself, if there's no superior body that can do that for you, how do you show that and still maintain the ideals of a humanist, free, engaging, meaningful education? You know, honestly, I think if we're going to have another intellectual dispute about PBL, let's make it about that.
Annette?
Yeah, but the micro went up because I think there's one else behind.
If you don't mind, then maybe question over there. Yes?
Thank you very much. My name is Mona Lisa Downs. I'm from Aalborg University. And I have been with Aalborg University since it was established in 1974, and I've seen all the 3 debates fought in that university. So thank you very, very, very much for a very enlightening and eye-opening talk here today, Virginia. I really, really enjoyed it. I reacted when my colleague Bettina said laissez-faire about the humanist approach to education. I think that's a bit harsh, maybe. I was thinking about the book Zen and the maintenance, the motorcycle, the art of maintenance, motorcycle maintenance, where they have this exam-less university, the university that is basically there for the good students. I was thinking about the irony of 20-25 years ago, there was such a push, such a pressure from politicians to enroll students in universities. Everybody needed a university education at that time. Today in Denmark, we are now starting rolling back. No, we do not need so many university graduates. So if we could establish universities with just the so-called good students, using the terminology from Biggs, or the academic students, the students who are actually interested in learning, then I think we could leave the task of doing examinations and finding out what they have actually learned to some authority outside the university. Employers or other governmental institutions, what do I know? But I could actually imagine, I could vision the university where we are there together to learn and to create knowledge, but not necessarily to control each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I like your reference to Pirsig. It was a very enlightening. I don't know if you're all familiar with Robert Pirsig's work. Yeah, so in it he describes he was fed up with exams and he didn't want this kind of boring exam-oriented learning. So what he did was he piled up all the student essays and he asked all the students to look at the essays and to rate them according to each other. Which one did they think was the best and which one did they think was the worst? And they put them in a pile and then give the top one an A and then a B and so forth until an F. So it was based not on objective criteria, but on the comparative quality of these essays. So this was another kind of approach to assessment offered by Pirsig.
Thank you very much. I believe in variation. And I don't want to put things into a Dewey box or a Kilpatrick box or whatever. I don't believe in either or. I believe in both and. And I think that also for different PBL models, it's extremely important that we have variations. Because what students they really need to learn is to reflect their own way of learning. And that's, if that is humanistic or not, I don't know, I don't care. I'm a pragmatist.
That's philosophy.
That's a box. But it's a box where you accept everything. Nearly. But I really think that it's important for students to learn in various ways. I also think it's important for assessment that they are assessed in various ways. So it's not only one way, sometimes it's controlled and sometimes it's actually needed to control. I'm sorry to say, after I don't know how many years as a university teacher, I have also discovered cheating. So sometimes control is needed, but assessment can also be an evaluation and a response to students' learning and something where you really facilitate students' reflection. So assessment is not just one thing. So what I'm actually trying to say is that I think variation is really, really important. And for my conclusions of your 6 boxes that you have set up, I would say that they are all needed, in my view. They are all needed in actually understanding this very complex system of learning. Because how do we actually learn? Do we know that? There's something going on in the brain, there's something going on in the emotions. It's such a complex system that it's impossible just to give one explanation. So, thank you very much, Jenny. I think you have painted a picture, and I think there are many more pictures, actually, to try to really understand what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I also believe that when we start to compare things, we are getting a little bit more wise. We start to learn when we compare one experience with another experience.
Thank you very much, Annette. So, indeed, as I said, I made a selection of the 3 things, the 3 debates that I thought were most relevant at the point where I am in my research. And yes, of course, it's not, I painted it a bit black and white to make it very clear what happened. And historically, it's also which historically were privileged by one or the other. Because historically speaking, people find it hard to live with this variation, as you say, especially in the 60s, 70s. People thought it's either one or the other. Yes, we need variation, but we also need to understand that variation. Students get very confused when you try and do 6 things at the same time, and they don't know what you're doing. And so what I hope is that when we clearly demarcate these ideas and those ideas, then we're better able to contrast them and to use them in a way that makes sense rather than it ended up being a big jumble of things which, yeah, students are easily confusable. So I think it's really good for us, PBLers, for us educationists, to open the black boxes of history, to see what was going on, to see what ideas we can draw from, and from there what we can do with it.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Jackie. Can you hear me with this? It's working? Okay. Well, I really liked the Dewey quote from 33, and I believe in those ideals, but when I see students and my own children and what they're doing with the internet, okay, and what's happening with education, I think Kilpatrick just won by default while we were looking the other way. Because the reality today, as far as I see it, is people rely on their own ability to poke around in the internet to learn things. This is so far from learning in the way that we see it could be. So maybe I'm sad, but I think Kilpatrick just won.
Has he though? And that's my really, my real question, and this goes beyond the confines of the school. It's a question Dewey asks himself in Democracy and Education. What are we trying to achieve for society? Are we trying to achieve students that know all the names of the Kardashian family and all sorts of manner of things, pieces of knowledge that they have gathered on the internet with no guidance, with no idea, with no background, and they come into class and they think they know this and they know that, and sometimes they think they know everything. But do they really? And do they understand what this means for their place in society, for their place in constructing the future? Or does this make them narcissistic, self-centered, and unable to function as citizens? I may be a little pessimistic, but I work with these students just coming in from that generation, and sometimes I think to myself, my God, you know, this is the product of the internet age. I think more than ever, they look to us, the teachers, for guidance because they've been so lost in the internet jungle for the past 10 years. They are craving the Deweyan teacher, and I think we need to live up to that expectation.
We have more questions. There? Yes.
Hi, I'm Andy Gerhardt from Lawrence Tech University in the United States. I want to go back to the airline pilot thing, because you had made an interesting comment. As far as I know, when you're testing outside of your schooling and you go for some nationalized test, there's a right answer, there's a wrong answer. If you get the wrong answer, you could crash and die. So it seems to me then you had made the comment, okay, so maybe in engineering, there's not maybe a national test to prove that you've learned what you needed to learn to be an engineer. And so you had mentioned then we need maybe a humanist approach to assess what they've learned. I'm curious to know why you think we need a humanist test within the university to test to know whether or not you've become a good engineer through problem-based learning.
A humanist test. I'm not completely sure.
A humanist way to assess what they, if they've learned what they need to learn to be a good and effective engineer.
So
that's maybe a misinterpretation of what you had commented to our colleague from Singapore down here.
Can I set the record straight quickly? My test was a simulator flight, and there's no right, no wrong. There's not even a proper program because you have a choice to do things. So in fact, the simulator training and the simulator testing is classic PBL. You're confronted with a problem, you have to do things. So just to get this straight, there's not this governmental test with a questionnaire, multiple choice questions, right and wrong. It's more complex and there's an assessment at the end.
But there's a right and wrong way to put the aileron.
That's the basis. That is knowledge. But you have to apply it in a context. You have to apply it in a real life situation.
No test about committing suicide and taking to that.
There's no sense to do that in the simulator.
There's a right and wrong way to select, which pipes you need in the building so they don't burst. That's an engineering problem. Maybe I misinterpreted, your quote, but it seems to me that there must be some final assessment that must be done at the end of your learning, where there are correct answers and there's clearly wrong answers, and there might be a lot of correct answers, and maybe that's the behaviorist point of view.
Well,
maybe it's not, and I would like your interpretation on that.
let's think. If Bill Gates or Steve Jobs had had to take a test with right and wrong answers, would the Mac ever have been invented? That's the question I ask myself sometimes. I mean, yes, there are certain things where there is a right procedure and a wrong procedure, but is there really always for every profession? Obviously, I'm not an engineer, but that's why I was saying for certain things there can be a license at the level of the profession. Of course, I don't want to fly an airline with a pilot who hasn't taken some kind of license. But what I'm saying is we need to look at what the outcomes are that we want, not in terms of terminal behavior, as the behaviorists put it. We need to ask ourselves the right questions about assessment. We need to ask ourselves, what kind of learners are we trying to encourage? What does this mean for them as people? People, not just workers, not just people in the productive capitalist system, but people. What does this mean for society? What does this mean for our future generations? These are all important questions, and yes, sure, maybe there is a place in there for evaluating a base of knowledge on engineering, for evaluating yes-no questions, but that's just a small part of it. We haven't answered the real question, which is, how do we shape the society of the future? You can't do that with a yes-no questionnaire. So we can't rely solely on behaviorist evaluations, and maybe they do have a place, as I said, for evaluating some base knowledge. But that's a very narrow education debate. I hope you agree.
Okay, one more question?
Thank you very much. Just a comment. I think it's not the point of what type of assessment. I think it's rather a point of we want to develop lifelong learners who adapt to new changes in future. Therefore, the assessment cannot stop at the end of university. We need to give those students additional skills for lifelong learning to enable them to adapt to future changes. Thank you.
Thank you. One final remark to answer your point. You know, I've become increasingly skeptical about the idea that there exists such a floating thing as a lifelong learning skill. If you ask me what that is, it's the belief in yourself, that you can learn whatever you want. That I don't know that that's a skill that can be trained per se, so much as, well, a very humanist approach of saying, of course you can do it because you're human, and then saying you need the interest and motivation to do it, and the resources to it, and off you go. I think it's appropriate to conclude with the humanist remark that probably every human has that capacity. Thank you.
Okay, our last question so that we can end this debate.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Ulrike Jäger, coming from Heilbronn University in Germany. I missed the first minute of your talk, I'm sorry, but I think we want to change society, and we are universities, that's the top of the top. And before that, our students have 15 years of education in some other system. So what about expanding PBL into school and into kindergarten and into some really educational system that helps the children to learn how to learn and to see what they are as persons, rather than making them so small that when they arrive at the university there's almost no creativity left in them. So, you know what I mean? Yeah, they are not the ones that started at 6 years. They are so obedient, and yeah, it's a sad thing.
Well, Dewey and Kilpatrick were both writing about young children, so they feel you. And it's happening. It is, PBL is seeping into K-12. And don't forget that I didn't want to talk about it, so I said it was too much, but Montessori, Steiner, these people...
No, it was not a critique of your own. Sorry,
No,
I enjoyed all the things I heard.
But I'm saying it's happening. What you're saying is true, it's necessary, and it's happening, so that's a good thing for us as educators.
Okay, so we're past the hour. We're going to end this debate, this session. I want to thank you, Virginie, for this hard task that you had now to answer all these questions. But I think it's because you were really inspiring, and your answers were also very convincing and very interesting examples which you've shown us. And it was pretty clear that assessment, the role of assessment in education, and all the pressure with the outcomes and presenting results, visible results, and the quantitative approach. And I'm sure we've all learned a lot, and we're going to think about these things in a more reflective way and put them in practice. So now I think we have a coffee break, and after we come back for the second keynote. Thank you.
Thank you.